r/NoSleep. Posted by u/abiroadwrites. My friend took me to a playhouse in the woods. I shouldn't have gone back. When I was younger, I was a big fan of urban exploration. My best friend at the time was too, and she knew all the best spots, and all the rules for safe exploring. Some of the rules were pretty obvious: wear tennis shoes and tall socks, wear something you can move quickly and freely in, take a flashlight and a bottle of water. Some of the rules were more subtle, learned through years of trial and error. This story is about one of those rules, and how I insisted on learning it the hard way. Nikki, my friend, was and still is one of the smartest people I've ever known, which means she was also the best person for me to get into urban exploring with. Not only did she know all the best places, but I trusted her so completely I would do what she said without argument, most of the time. After our adventures exploring an abandoned Macy's, an old barn, and several spur-of-the-moment road trips, Nikki told me there was somewhere special she wanted to go. She wouldn't tell me anything about it until we got there, which was unusual but only made me more excited to see whatever it was. I remember the first time I visited that place with her. It was late summer, when the leaves haven't started to turn yet, but you can feel the first cold spark in the air that promises the seasons are right about to change. One of the things I liked about exploring with Nikki was that she always drove us, so I got to sit in the passenger seat and watch the scenery pass us by. That day we drove out into the hills on the outskirts of town, passing neighborhoods, then houses, then fields with the occasional house, then nothing but trees, fields, and hills. I memorized the route we took, some part of me knowing already that I would want to return to this place. I wish I wasn't so good at memorizing directions. We had stopped for coffee before making our way out of town, and we left and sang along loudly to the music on the radio as she drove. After a long time Nikki pulled the car off to the side of the road, parked in an area that had no discernible markers as far as I could tell, and said with a grin, "We're here." I stepped out of the car and breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of tall grass, old-growth trees, and rotting wood. I looked around at the tall pines and lovely aspens, then smiled at Nikki. I said, "All right, I'm not sure this one qualifies as urban exploration, but it's a nice spot." Nikki smirked and tossed her long, curly brown hair over her shoulder. "I guess it's not urban, no. But you're really going to like this." I followed her as we walked through the woods. There was no path and I wasn't entirely sure there ever had been. It looked and felt like no one had ever been out here except for us. I had a brief moment of fear remembering all those stories about people snapping and sacrificing their friends or classmates to Slender Man, then shook it off. After a few minutes of hiking over dead trees, through tall grass, and past strange detritus, I'm pretty sure I saw an old wagon completely overgrown with weeds at one point. I saw a structure not too far from us, partly obscured by the trees. Nikki pointed to the structure and said, "There it is." Just past a small river, hidden in the line of trees, was a miniature version of an old Victorian house. At one point in time it had been painted pink and blue, the trim around the windows had probably been white, and my inner child fell in love with it instantly. In a hushed, almost reverent tone I asked, "What is it?" Nikki gave me her most pleased smile, the expression she reserved for our best discoveries, and whispered back, "It's an old playhouse. I'm guessing some rich guy had it built for his daughters, ages and ages ago. It's beautiful, in kind of an unsettling way, right?" I nodded. It was beautiful in an unsettling way. There was something about it that made me feel like I would hear children's voices, or see a little girl dart out from behind it at any moment. The playhouse was at least 2 stories from what I could tell, and made of wood and stone rather than plastic. The paint was chipping off, the roof was caving in, and most of the glass windows were broken. I was entranced, and began walking towards it, sure Nikki would know the best way to cross the river to get to it, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me back. All she said was, "No." I laughed. "What do you mean? We came all the way out here and you don't want to go look at it?" She shook her head, an abnormally serious expression on her usually cheerful face. "We can stay on this side of the river and look at it, but we're not going over there." I chuckled again, but I was starting to get frustrated. "We can wade through the river if there's no bridge or anything. I promise I'll stand right next to your car until I'm dry if you don't have any towels." Nikki had learned the hard way to always keep a towel in the trunk of her car. She let go of my arm, but took a step back. "Mara, look around. Do you see beer bottles anywhere? Cigarettes? Soda cans? Candy wrappers?" I looked around at the ground, noting in surprise that I didn't see anything of the kind. "No, I guess whoever owns this land maintains it really well." Nikki said, "Nobody maintains it, it's just that no one wants to be out here for very long. If teenagers won't party here then we shouldn't explore either." There's a reason no one wants to get close to that thing. We can admire from a distance, but we don't need to cross the river. Just trust me, okay? I couldn't. I had always trusted her implicitly, and it had always been a good call, but this time I just couldn't understand why she was refusing to let me look closer at this amazing little discovery. We stood there in the field arguing about it for a few more minutes, until Nikki finally threatened to abandon me there if I took one more step closer to the old playhouse. Of course I had to take another step towards it, and she immediately turned around and started back towards the car, ready to make good on her promise. I laughed and chased after her saying, "I was kidding. I'm kidding." She kept walking, not stopping until we made it back to the car, but I could tell she wasn't really angry with me. We brushed ourselves off, checked each other for ticks, another rule she learned the hard way, then got back in the car and went to the mall. When Nikki dropped me off at my house later that day, she looked me in the eyes and said, "I was serious, Mara. If there's no sign of humans around a clearly man-made structure, that's a good sign. You need to be careful." I smiled, but I couldn't meet her eyes as I said, "Yeah, of course. I got you." I could tell she didn't feel good about it, but she went home anyway. I spent the next few weeks thinking about the playhouse nonstop. I had taken a few pictures of it, and I spent all my time looking at them, zooming in and out and studying the structure as if I was going to take a test on it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and on one warm fall Saturday I got in my car and traced our route back to the old playhouse. It was a lot harder to find alone, and I had to drive back and forth on the road for a while before I found the spot where I thought we had parked the last time. It was mid-afternoon, and the first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was the total lack of sound. There were no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, nothing. I couldn't remember if I had heard animals or not when I came here with Nikki, but I pushed on despite my unease. I walked through the brush and tall grass for a while before I finally saw the playhouse in the distance. I had imagined that scene in my head in the days leading up to it, and I had expected to feel elation. Instead I felt a vague unease as storm clouds gathered in the distance. I told myself it was just my brain fooling me, because of the storm clouds, and pushed on. When I got to the river I walked up and down the banks a bit, looking for a log or some boards to cross on. There was nothing, which only made me think of Nikki's warning about avoiding places other people didn't want to be. I scoffed, maybe that was the best place to be, for once Nikki didn't know what she was talking about. After a few minutes I was able to locate a fallen log and slide my way across it carefully. I almost tripped at one point and felt my heart rate increase dreadfully despite how shallow the water below was. I told myself it was just because I didn't want to get in my car wet, or bother with washing the car towel Nikki had insisted I get, but something in my head screamed for me to turn back. When I stood in front of the playhouse, it all felt worth it. Despite the peeling paint, chipping wood, and cracked glass, there was an odd and distinct beauty to the old place. It reminded me of a dollhouse I'd had as a kid. I stood there in the woods for a long time, just admiring it before I got up the courage to go closer. I snapped a picture and sent it to Nikki, but there was no cell service. When I finally entered the structure, the first thing I noticed was the simple wooden floor, and how clean it was aside from some dirt and grass and a few small piles of leaves. That may not sound very clean, but if you've been in a lot of abandoned structures you'll know what I mean. That's not just unusual, it's bizarre. I glanced up and saw that there was a small hatch in the ceiling with a simple rope ladder hanging down. The rope had frayed in the middle on one side, and slightly higher up on the other, so it was cut and dangling. I put one hand on it and tugged, then decided it wasn't sturdy enough to support my body weight. Part of me was kind of proud of myself, even though I hadn't listened to Nikki when she asked me not to explore this place. I was still using her safety lessons. I figured if this went well, I could try and convince her to come back with me so she could see the place for herself. I snapped more pictures from the inside, the walls, the ceiling, the broken windows. After a moment I noticed something in the pile of leaves and walked closer to investigate. It was a child's teacup set, perfectly intact and made from porcelain. I walked towards it like I was in a dream, and when I got there noticed the wooden slats on the wall leading up to another hatch in the ceiling. I tested them, pushing down with one foot while I braced against the wall. When I told Nikki about it later she said I should have used my hand, or a stick instead in case the wall collapsed, and when I had determined they were sturdy enough to hold me I began to climb. When I got to the second floor of the playhouse I nearly fell back to the ground floor in shock. Propped in one corner was a life-size doll of a man. It had a cloth body and porcelain head and hands. The face looked angry, with painted-on eyebrows and bright pink lips pulled down in a grimace, but the eyes looked more pained or afraid than angry. It was horribly unsettling, and I had to take a few minutes clinging to the wooden slats to catch my breath. After a moment I realized I was hanging on pieces of rotting wood at least 8 to 10 feet up from the ground, and I scrambled onto the floor. The room was small, probably 6 feet across in either direction, and this room had more detritus in it. I saw scraps of what looked like fancy children's dresses among the wreck from the roof having caved in. I couldn't tell for sure how old the playhouse was, but years of snow, wind, and rain had clearly taken a toll. There were boards and shingles all over the floor, and when I glanced up at the ceiling I could see only a few structural beams, and only trees and sky beyond that. I looked back down at the floor and felt a little snake of worry wriggling in my stomach. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. I shoved down my worry and kicked out at the crumbling wood beams on the floor, wanting to move them so I could see what was underneath. The smiling face of a little girl looked back at me from under the rubble and I screamed, stumbling backwards and landing in the lap of the life-size doll. It wrapped its arms around me and I screamed even harder, then burst into tears of relief when I realized the arms had just fallen on me. I crawled away from the doll and laid on the floor for a moment, alternating between laughing and crying until I felt something touch my ankle. It was a soft touch, so gentle I told myself I could pretend it didn't happen. But my stupid head turned of its own volition, looking down at my own foot almost accusingly. A tiny, soft hand rested gently on my ankle and I allowed my eyes to follow the hand up to the wrist, to the elbow, to the shoulder, and then to the tiny smiling face. I stared at it in horror, trying to process what I was seeing. There in the rubble was a little girl. She was the size of a very small child, and her skin was shiny and white like porcelain, but moved like regular skin. Her hair was pitch black and her eyes were a shiny, happy blue. She stroked my ankle gently and asked, "Do you want to be my friend?" I don't know any other way to say this, but her voice was like porcelain too, delicate, bright, and oddly ethereal. I jerked my ankle away and crawled backwards like a crab, trying to put some distance between us. As soon as I did, her face fell, and for a moment I felt like the world's biggest monster. I said, I just want to go. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here." Big tears welled up in her eyes as she said, "You don't want to play with me?" I was at a loss. On the one hand, a little girl had just crawled out of the rubble of a broken-down old playhouse in the middle of nowhere and was stroking my ankle like a creepy guy at a bar. On the other hand, apparently all she wanted was someone to play with, and I felt like kind of a massive jerk saying no to such a sweet request. I also felt like a massive fool for feeling bad instead of running away. I edged backwards again and she asked, "Are you scared of me?" She slowly started crawling out of the rubble, revealing an equally doll-like body and strangely pristine pink, white, and blue dress. Instead of crawling towards me, she pulled herself up and walked over to the life-size doll on the floor. She pressed her hand to its cheek lovingly and the doll's eyes flew open, revealing the real human eyes under the painted porcelain-looking ones. I screamed and the doll opened its porcelain mouth as if to scream too, but the girl ripped her hand away and the face went back to a painted porcelain mask. She said, "Daddy was always scared of me too." That was more than I could handle and I threw myself down the open shaft with the rope ladder, giving myself some nasty rope burn as I used it to try and break my fall. I stumbled, fell, and heard a tiny porcelain voice say, "Don't run away, I'll have to make Daddy chase you." I decided to take that bet and sprinted out the door and through the shallow water, not stopping until I got back to my car. I fumbled the keys once, twice, before managing to get them in the door to unlock it, already sobbing in terror and relief as I slid in and locked the door behind me. I looked up to see a little girl holding the hand of the life-size doll, its head rolling limply on its shoulders, and I threw the car in reverse and backed out onto the road. I made it all the way home before I realized my cell was missing. It must have fallen out of my pocket when I ran away from the house. It was only a few hours before Nikki showed up at my house, looking pale and angry. She hugged me tightly and said, "What the hell, Mara? You went back without me?" I burst into tears all over again and had to pull myself together to explain what had happened. When I was done, she said, "I don't think I'd be able to believe that story if you didn't look so scared right now. Did you take anything before you went out there?" I shook my head. "I was stone cold sober, Nick." She nodded vaguely, just as her phone buzzed. She held it up to show that the message had come from my old number, the phone I had lost in the woods. I watched as she opened it up and showed me a picture of my car driving away from the playhouse.